Welcome. Today we're going to basically do a review of basic high school American history. It's still a fun lecture. I'm excited. Let's go to the reading review. Do we have any questions about the Declaration of Independence? I have a few key takeaways that I want you to note from this. Declaration of Independence. Big takeaway here is that Thomas Jefferson, writing the Declaration of Independence, says there are these certain unalienable natural rights. Basically, the idea before this, in Britain at least, is that your rights come from the monarch or from God, right? There is this other entity that then gives you those rights. And John Locke comes along, and Thomas Jefferson, plagiarizing him, comes along and says, no, there are inherent rights to being a human being. Hence his argument there. So that's kind of his philosophical argument behind independence. He then makes kind of a practical argument. Government is not legitimate unless you have consent of the governed. This is something called social contract theory. John Locke is a big fan of it. Basically, you, the people, enter into a contract with your government when they govern you. You say, hey, it's okay, I'm giving up some of my freedom because you are giving me security in return. So the only legitimate government then is one that has the consent of the governed. This is the fun one. People have the right to replace tyrants. Has anyone ever heard the Thomas Jefferson quote, and I'm paraphrasing here, the whole, the tree of liberty from time to time needs to be watered with the blood of tyrants? You know, that like kind of badass thing that he said, right? Basically, he's saying, so we have the philosophical argument up here, then we have kind of the pragmatic argument, and then we have like his little jab there where it's like, we can play it easy or we can play it hard. And then most of the document, which I don't think comes across in public conceptions of what the Declaration of Independence is just like kind of whining, right? He's just like, I don't like these taxes. They're bad. We don't like how you're doing things. It's bad. Virtual representation, which we're going to get into, isn't really a thing. And then finally, that leads to the formal independence claim. So again, we have philosophical argument, practical argument, threat. This is kind of the legal understanding of why they are doing this claim of independence, right? They're listing these abuses, so we have a justification, and then they have the formal independence claim. And one thing I cannot emphasize enough is that the Declaration of Independence is not law. It's not a law binding document. I think that like a lot of average people, what they do is they'll say like, I know my rights, I know I'm under the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Well, clearly you don't, because the Declaration of Independence is just kind of a thing that exists in our history. It's the same as like any famous speech given in our history, right? Like you don't hear people talking about the rights under the Reverend's speech on the sinners in the hands of an angry God, or the famous city on a hill speech, right? This is the same type of thing as that, except, you know, it led to our country actually existing. The preamble. We're going to enter the Constitution corner. Literally, it says that we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice and ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and ensure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States of America. But what does that mean? We had a point in the front here. What's your name again? Yes, it comes from we, the people, not a king, right? Because we have these natural rights. A thing that I want you to think about when you're reading the Constitution through the semester is this question: who are the people? Yes, I'm getting at slavery here. That's kind of really important and foundational to our country. But also a lot of other things. Talking about property rights, talking about freedoms of corporations, right? Corporations are people, my friend. This also is like stating the mission statement of the Constitution. It's saying that we're writing all this crap down because things are a mess right now, and we want them to stop being a mess. So we're going to forge a just, secure, and thriving union. And then finally, we're going to safeguard liberty for future generations, whatever that means. Basically, things are a mess right now. We're going to fix them so that our children don't have to deal with the problems that we're dealing with right now. right? It would be really embarrassing if they went through this Revolutionary War and then all of the subsequent issues with Native Americans and, like disgruntled veterans, which we'll get into, just to have the country like fall apart. All right, the road to the Constitution. You took a high school history course, American history, you probably will be familiar with most of this stuff. If you're not familiar with most of this stuff, you should not feel bad. 90% of Americans don't actually know this stuff in their hearts. They just kind of forget it. So, my conception of the history of American government actually goes back to the 13th century. And that's different, I feel, than a lot of people who teach this class, simply because I want to trace back the origins of what we view as Western democracy. So, we're in England. It is the 13th century. There's this guy, King John. He's kind of doing some rough stuff that the nobles, who are the only real people who matter, and because who cares about the peasants, right? He's doing some stuff that the nobles don't like. So the nobles come to him, basically say, we have all the armies, we have all the land, we have all the money. You're going to do what we say here, right? We still have this notion of divine right of kings and all of that, so we'll let you be there, but we don't want you to be abusing your power anymore. So these barons come in, and they basically get some compromises from the king. First of these is this notion of due process and an early form of jury rights. Essentially, it's trial by your peers in a court, right? When I say court, I don't mean like a courtroom like Judge Judy. I mean like Game of Thrones type stuff, like in a court. And it's the origins of this notion of the rule of law, which pervades a lot of Western common law based societies, that there are these certain ideas that we need to follow, due process and jury rights being two of them. Additionally, you have this notion of no tax without consent. Essentially, what they're trying to push for here is an abolition of something called scutage. That's not super important. But the spirit of it is, we have money, we're willing to give it to the king for defense, right? This kind of social contract type stuff, even though that hasn't been codified yet. However, we want to be able to have a say in how you're collecting that money and what it goes for. And then the Magna Carta as a whole serves as a model for later charters of government. It's the Constitution, as well as a lot of Western democracies in America and within Britain as well, right? The British Constitution is this weird thing that just keeps evolving and keeps getting added to. It's not like our Constitution where there's hard limits on how you amend it or anything. It's more of a fluid document than even our fluid document is. I make the argument that it is the foundation for modern Western liberal governance. I want to make a note that there are certain legalistic philosophies and the like that come out of Asia centuries before this, but the founding fathers didn't care about Eastern philosophy. So while the ideas are similar, they didn't really pull from that. So we go ahead 300 years, and we have the founding of British America here. It's important to note that the first two consistent, stable, and thriving, I use quotation marks around thriving, American colonies were kind of late to the game. In 1607, you have Jamestown, which was an essentially fiscal endeavor, right? You have these lords and business people who make investments and want to basically get land, get resources, get money from the colonies, and then you have Plymouth in 1620, right? And the conception of pilgrims that we have here is not entirely correct either, right? So you have capitalists here, even though capitalism isn't a huge thing yet, and then you have not people who are fighting for freedom of religion so much as religious separatists. They don't like what the crown is doing with religion and how decadent and indulgent in bacchanalia Europe is becoming. So they basically take a bunch of puritanic weirdos and ship off to the United States. Because they're a bunch of people who are there with the goal of producing money for the mother country, or because they're a bunch of religious undesirables anyway, you start to get this history of colonial self-rule that is unlike a lot of other colonies that you would see later, for example, British rule of India, it's very hands-off. They kind of let them do what they want, and they create informal governing bodies and their own laws to govern their society. This is important for later. When I'm talking about Jamestown in particular, and this notion that they're left to rule themselves, this is largely because of this concept called mercantilism. Does anybody know what mercantilism is? Yes, exactly. So what they just said in the back there was that it's this notion that colonies exist as peripheral entities to a mother country, and the produce from those peripheral entities do not exist to enrich the colonies themselves, but rather to be shipped back and enrich the core nation. This is a very interesting and new notion at the time that thinkers like Adam Smith would then turn into more of what we understand as modern capitalism today. Mercantilism is the foundation of the triangle trade as well, if you have ever heard of that. That is the slave trade between Africa, the French West Indies, and the British colonies. And finally, this colonial self-rule turns into this notion of salutary neglect. That is, that the government of Great Britain doesn't really care what's going on in the colonies so long as they get their money, so long as they can send their undesirables there. Look up the history of Rhode Island if you ever want to learn about that. It's very similar to Australia, although not entirely. And so they give them this kind of autonomy. So already we see this culture developing that is fiscally chafing at their mother country, however, fiscally self-interested in the form of Jamestown, and focused on their own autonomy and independence. This all comes crashing down in 1763. There's this thing that happens that everybody else in the world calls the 7 Years' War, and we, because we're cool and different, called the French and Indian War. It's the 7 Years' War. Basically, this is could be argued to be the first truly world war. It was fought in theaters across Europe, the Caribbean, India, and the North American frontier, but largely was between the British and the French over colonial possessions. We call it the French and Indian War because we mainly fought the French and the Native Americans. Surprise, surprise. And in the end, Britain comes out on top and gains this vast territory in the Americas, basically pushes France's holdings up to Canada and out to what would become the Louisiana Purchase. The issue with that, though, is that wars are really expensive, and the British war debt soars from 130 million pounds to 176 million pounds, which is frankly crippling at the time. In addition to the sheer amount of debt, the cost of the interest comes up to almost 60% of the produced revenue for Britain at the time. Basically, what happens is that Britain decides, well, you know, we fought this war for these land holdings in America. We got these land holdings in America. We don't get to enjoy them directly. So maybe, you know, the people who kind of started this war and caused it, the American colonists, should pay for part of it. So maybe that's what we'll do. And they start to take more of an interest in the American colonies. So one, something like this war doesn't happen again. And two, they can recuperate some of their loss. The colonists are not on the same wavelength as the British. They basically are like, hell yeah, we just won this war. Okay, we're awesome, we're young, we're out there, we're doing things. We're going to get a ton of land for ourselves. And you know what? Because we won this war for those guys, they're going to even lighten up our taxes because we're the ones who fought and died for this. That's also not what happens. King George III comes in, he's like, hey, guys, there's a lot of crap happening right now. I can deal with the French because we have a long-standing relationship, being British and all, but it takes a while to negotiate treaties with all of these disparate Native American nations. And so what I'm going to do is say, hey, you guys can't settle west of the Appalachians for a time because you're just going to start slaughtering Native Americans and we're going to have another war and it's not going to be good. So they're aiming to calm these native conflicts. The British colonists, who are like, we were going to get all this land and all these light taxes, basically say, well, that sucks. And so all these land speculators are pretty upset. One of them, you might have heard of him, he's a little known guy named George Washington. He's pretty upset about this. He also was a veteran of the French and Indian War and also arguably one of the people who made it worse. And so he's feeling a little peeved about all of this. And as a whole, the American colonies start to distrust the British crown a little bit more. It's important to note, though, that this proclamation in particular kind of highlights that at this time it's not just America versus the British, but we also have the Native Americans in here as an active participant in American history. They are shaping what is happening here right now. On top of this proclamation line, you start to get what they call the intolerable acts, but they are essentially at their core revenue acts to increase revenues for the crown and decrease the national debt. So first you get the Sugar Act of 1764. I'm going to highlight a few of them here, in which there are duties on molasses coming in. And again, while this kind of makes sense why they want to do this, to increase revenues, they do a weird thing with it where it actually makes molasses and sugar imports slightly cheaper, but it does undercut colonial smugglers and rum runners. And so the colonists aren't the ones seeing the revenue anymore, so much as the traders from the West Indies and the crown through these revenues. Then you get the Stamp Act. This is the most famous of them. You can see some examples of stamps here and some propaganda opposed to it. Essentially, paper is the rage at the time. People are like, hey, it's been a little while since the Gutenberg Bible. We're democratizing, books. There are pamphlets everywhere. Newspapers are pretty cool. And playing cards. We love playing cards and letters. Everything paper requires a stamp, which obviously the colonists don't like because they are paying taxes on those stamps. There's this debate that happens around this about internal and external taxes. Essentially, colonists are like kind of fine if the local state assembly is taxing them because they know that guy, that's Jim from down the street, but they don't really like external taxes because what is some British, dandy doing telling me that I have to pay taxes on my playing cards? I want to be able to lose my money like a real American using those playing cards drunkenly to lose all of my money in poker. And in addition, the British need bodies to enforce these regulations. They're sending more and more troops being interested in the colonies over to govern them, right? And part of this is writs of assistance. It's basically open warrants. You don't really need a warrant to search anyone. You can stay with them. Troops can stay with colonists. And people are not big fans of this. The notion of seeing armed troops wandering through their cities kind of puts people on edge and seems a little bit like a tyrannical government. Have any of you heard this phrase, taxation without representation? That should be all of you if you have a pulse and are American. It's not entirely the whole story. Basically, this is a narrative that comes about that is kind of propaganda, kind of true. You have a bunch of what I frame as elites. They're not entirely elites. Think of them as like a mercantile class or a merchant class of people, also southern planters, who are not being deprived of their property so much as having their potential profits cut into. They are still making a ton of money, but they're making slightly less money, and they don't like that. What's actually happening is this debate between virtual and direct representation. Virtual representation is what the Crown is arguing is happening. They, in Parliament, are making regulations on behalf of the colonists, right? They're not actually a part of the kingdom. They are rather these mercantile entities made to serve the Crown. So their virtual representation, yeah, we're governing in your interests here, and you can trust us. And the American colonists are saying, no, that's not how that works. We want to have a direct say in how we're being governed. Remember the Magna Carta? They're basically saying, you guys did this back in 1215 with the king. Why can't we do this with you now? This develops into kind of these insurgent groups, these ideological groups, the most famous of which, Sons of Liberty, starting to protest throughout the American colonies, particularly in New England and the Northeast. And they start to push for civic action. Boycotts of British goods, boycotts of paying these taxes and tariffs, and this kind of notion of like solidarity really starts to unite them for the first time. Before this, they're all like, well, you know, what happens in South Carolina doesn't really impact Massachusetts so much. And now they're like, hey, if in South Carolina you guys stop paying the duties for this thing, we'll do that in New England on this different thing, and then, you know, we're buddies. Typified example of an event that made everything worse is the Boston Massacre of 1770. Basically, you have British troops in, I frame it as a port city, it's Boston, but really it could have been any port city. It just was waiting for something bad to happen. It could have been Philadelphia, it could have been New York, but it happened to be Boston. So remember those writs of assistance, that's why there are so many British troops around, and it starts where some colonists are really upset with them being there, and they might be a little drunk or something, and they throw some snowballs at them, and the Brits, they have these guns, and they're like, well, we have these guns, we might as well use them. We're feeling threatened by these snowballs. So they shoot them, they shoot at the people throwing snowballs, and they kill 5 of them. That's not very popular. So Paul Revere and Samuel Adams, you saw Samuel Adams on the last slide there, pointing at a tasty beverage. He and Paul Revere produce this etching that is very gross but very sensational, and spread it throughout the colonies, start to win over more people to their side, showing this brutality of these Brits in red shooting all of these poor people and getting their blood everywhere. What pushed this further is a sense of miscarriage of justice. The soldiers are mostly acquitted. Ironically enough, their lawyer in this case is John Adams, the second president of the United States, and a very important person for the creation of the Declaration of Independence. He gives them a solid legal defense and basically gets them off for the most part. That leads to the Tea Act and the Boston Tea Party of 1773, another commonly misunderstood historical event. Essentially, the East India Trading Company had a monopoly on tea, mostly worldwide, but in particular in the colonies at the time. But they were really struggling because of some issues with shipping lanes and the ability for American colonists and smugglers to undercut them. So what actually happens is the Tea Act makes tea cheaper for the colonists. It does not make it more expensive. It does not make it intolerable for them to drink tea, but rather reduces the administrative burdens and barriers and makes it easier for the East India Trading Company to sell their tea, which of course makes American merchants and smugglers unhappy. A cheaper tea is not the same as an accepted tax, right? I think, again, people think that there's this notion that, like, they increased the price of everything and everybody got mad about that. No, in a lot of circumstances, they made things cheaper. They just gave preferential treatment to their buddies rather than the Americans who were already kind of extra legally profiting off of this salutary neglect. The merchants, as I said, fear undercutting from this, and you have 16 colonists dump 342 chests into the Boston harbor of tea. That is the equivalent of about 10,000 pounds. That's not weight, that's money, of tea, which was quite a lot. Those 16 colonists are dressed in Native American disguise. This is also, I think, commonly misunderstood. I think people think about them in disguise and they're like, oh, they're trying to blame it on the Native Americans, right? Fly under the radar so the British don't know who is the group that is responsible for doing this, but that's not true at all. They're not so concerned with obfuscating who they are and what they're doing so much as signaling something symbolically. What could dressing up as Native Americans symbolize here? It is showing that they are Americans. There's obviously some problems with this because, like Charles pointed out, they think that they are lesser than, and there are all sorts of issues with this as we get into the 19th century. But for the time, what they're trying to do is show that we are, in fact, Americans. So finally, there's enough issues that they get together for the First Continental Congress. 12 of the 13 colonies meet in Philadelphia. Who here is from Georgia? Boo, you guys didn't attend. Come on, guys. Basically, so they send 56 delegates, and that includes people like radicals like Sam Adams or even conservatives like Joseph Galloway. You're not going to need to know who those people are. They meet in Philadelphia, go Birds, and they endorse this thing called the Suffolk Resolves. Basically, what this is doing is saying, hey, everybody, we're all in this together. We're going to not follow these intolerable acts. We're not going to follow these revenue acts here. And they try to get this unified boycott of British imports. They agree for the most part to not import British goods or goods from their friends. And they create this kind of shadow government. It's the first thing that we really see in terms of a national government in the form of enforcement committees. Basically, like, there's going to be people who think that it's going to be profitable to go around what we're trying to do here, and so we need people to kind of enforce these new laws that we have. So, like, there's some irony here, right, where they're like, okay, guys, this is all about freedom and liberty, particularly freedom and liberty in trade, but we're going to make sure that you guys don't trade with the people we don't want you to. You're going to notice a lot that is hypocritical about this. Basically, the framers, they created a country. It's pretty cool, but they were also still people. You should remember that, and they have their own personal interests in it. At the same time, they're like, hey guys, we don't want independence yet. We still really like the idea of being hoity-toity British citizens, despite the people throwing stuff in the harbor. And so we're going to say that we're still loyal to the crown, but we demand the rights of Englishmen. All right? You can start to see how we're transitioning from the Magna Carta, right? There are rights of Englishmen. And start to transition, if we can't find rights as Englishmen, into this kind of Lockean perspective that there are rights of human beings. If we can't be Englishmen, we can at least be humans. This thing called Lexington and Concord happens, 1775, kind of screws everything up. First battle, the Revolutionary War. We're going to kind of gloss over the Revolutionary War. I'm not a war historian. I don't really care about the war. It's not super important. You know who won. And it causes the Second Continental Congress, when they reconvene in May, to really reconsider things. They push this gentleman, I don't know if you've heard of him, mentioned him earlier, named George Washington, to head the Continental Army. And people think about this, oh, he was this great general. That's why they asked him. It was predominantly a political decision. Where was George Washington from? What state? Virginia. Why is that significant? So what we do is we're like, hey, you have Sam Adams over here who's like saying, guys, we need to tar and feather all these people collecting taxes. We're going to be radicals and we're going to throw them out. We need freedom and liberty for everybody. And that includes slaves. And then everybody's like, okay, you just lost half the country. Let's get George Washington in here. He owns slaves. He's kind of a respected war hero, even though he really was not that good at things in the French and Indian War, but he's the closest thing to a kind of general type person we have, so let's get him in there. So they rally around George Washington. It's a political decision. They're like, hey, let's unify North and South. July 4th, 1776, they create the Declaration of Independence that was largely prompted by pamphlets circulating like Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Common Sense, yeah, it's a treatise on human rights and on liberty. It's also propaganda. That's the purpose of a pamphlet. And we get this notion from that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Often now there's this discussion about America failing to live up to the promise of the Declaration of Independence. But, America has lived up to the promise of the Declaration of Independence. It believed that all men were created equal, and at the time, men were white dudes who owned things. You understand somebody's value by how much they own. The original phrase is not life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is John Locke saying that it is life, liberty, and property. So then the war happens. Basically, we couldn't have won it without the French. We give the French a lot of crap. I give the French a lot of crap. The British give the French a lot of crap. A lot of people give the French a lot of crap. They give a lot of money. They didn't win it for us, but they gave us a lot of money. They gave us some ships. For instance, Yorktown, we couldn't have, done that without their help with a naval blockade. And essentially, we get to 1783, where you have the Treaty of Paris. This is a famous unfinished painting of the signing of the Treaty of Paris, in which Britain agrees to recognize the U.S.'s borders, at least the colonial borders. But there's a problem. So after the French and Indian War, where the British had all of this debt, now the Americans have a ton of debt because, as I said before, war is expensive. It's so expensive. You have a lot of soldiers that are due pay. You have a lot of debts. The French, you owe them a lot of money, and they're currently, I don't know if you know this, 1780s through the 90s, having some problems of their own to deal with too, and they kind of need that money. We produce a governing document that doesn't really live up to the moment. You have the Articles of Confederation, which states that it is a firm league of friendship, which is very funny because, in fact, everybody hated each other. At the time, the conception of a state in the United States was that of a nation-state. Can someone explain to me what a nation-state is? A nation-state is basically what we view as a country now. Part of this is that each state retains sovereignty. Their state assemblies were their national assemblies. But part of that is that there's kind of this overarching governing authority, this legislature, where each state can send, representatives, but each state only gets one vote. There are 13 votes in the Congress, and each state gets one. There is no executive, there's no president, there is no judiciary, there are no courts. And the biggest problem, remember, wars are expensive. The United States can't tax. They've decided the British taxed us too much, we're done with that. Taxes are out their last season. What's in now is requisitions. Basically, we can say, hey guys, give us some money, okay? It'd be really nice if you guys gave us some money. The problem with that is they're not enforceable. The main issue here is that the kind of vibe of the Articles of Confederation is it assumes in this abstract sense that all of these individual states have this broader ethereal notion that if they work together, it's for the betterment of all humanity, and it's going to be so nice, and we're going to be friends with each other, and it's going to work out. But that's not how people are, and that's certainly not how the governors of this time were. Governors as in people who govern, not governors as in governor of state. So there are several reasons why the Articles failed. The issue with the war debts never went away because taxation, they can't do it. And the issue with requisitions is that people just ignored them. Each state also was printing its own currency. They were printing paper currency, which at the time was not a real thing that people valued, so it was essentially worthless. So you start getting massive inflation in the colonies. You also have interstate tariff wars. Basically, what's happening is, for example, famously, New York would tariff firewood coming from New Jersey going into the New York harbor, but they kind of needed that because they needed to heat their homes. I don't know if you've ever been to New York, but it gets a little cold in the winter, and also, cook their food and all of that stuff and run their industry. So it creates resentment between the states and also basically destroys the economy because, as we all know, tariffs are a cost that is passed on to the consumer. And in this case, the consumers are actually people with power. They're people who have a vested economic interest in the success of their colonies. The other thing, too, is that there's no standing military. If every state is their own independent country, there is no United States Army as we conceive of it. It's rather a loose group of a bunch of militias, and everybody's really tired because they just fought the Revolutionary War, and before that, they fought the French and Indian War, and they all just want to go home, and they all just want to get paid, and they want to make their farms, and take care of their many kids, and they just can't do that. And additionally, America basically pissed off everybody in the world except for the French, and again, the French are too busy dealing with their own stuff to actually come to our aid, so nobody's gonna bail us out here. And finally, the amendments to the Articles of Confederation required a unanimous vote. Remember, every state has one vote. So say all 12 of the states, except for like Pennsylvania, want something to happen, and Pennsylvania's like, actually, that offends our Quaker sensibilities. They can't do it, which really sucks. So no progress is made. So obviously, they can't operate like this. They meet in Annapolis in 1786 to talk about what's going on. They're like, hey guys, there's a problem. Let's meet together. What do we do about it? They all agree in that meeting to have another meeting. Very efficient. They say, let's all meet in Philadelphia. That went well last time. Let's meet in Philly in a couple years, maybe a year. It was a year. And we're going to talk about what we can do about this. At the same time, there's this thing that happens, Shays' Rebellion. In 1787, Daniel Shay, he is a Massachusetts farmer, and he was facing farm foreclosure, like a lot of veterans of the Revolutionary War at the time. He didn't have money from the Revolution to pay for it. He was away, could not earn revenues from his farm, therefore the bankers would have owned the land, etc. Foreclosed on his property, bills unpaid, and so they're like, hey guys, you remember this thing we just did? This revolution for the rights of all humans. That's kind of ingrained in our culture now. Surely they'll understand if we make a showing of force here. They didn't understand. They were all killed. But still there's this fear because all of these guys who we see as the framers of the Constitution, who did the Declaration of Independence, are like, guys, we kind of screwed up. There's no way we can pay these people, and there are a lot more of them than there are of us, so we gotta figure this out now before they come for all of our stuff like we just came for all of Britain's stuff. And they're worried about anarchy breaking out in the country. Additionally, America's credit rating is terrible. Can someone explain to me a country's credit rating? Does anyone understand that countries have credit? Okay. So a country's credit rating is not like a credit score. It kind of is now, but at the time it was more like this notion, in the same way with a credit card. It's a score for how well they believe you can pay back your debt. And it's very important that you are considered a valuable or a rational person to lend money to, right? Countries run on deficits, basically. So we have all this debt. We can't borrow to pay it off. We have no credit. People are seeing that there are these people who are rising up in rebellion, and so we can't borrow money to pay them off and put ourselves in even more debt, and it's just a disaster. And all this leads to a clear path set forward for the Constitutional Convention, which we will cover in the next class.